Part 4, Chapter 3, Our Muzzled Freedom. But even when all the main things about the Gulag Archipelago are written, read, and understood, will there be anyone, even then, who grasps what our freedom was like? What sort of a country it was that for whole decades dragged that archipelago about inside itself? It was my fate to carry inside me a tumor the size of a large man's fist. This tumor swelled and distorted my stomach, hindered my eating and sleeping, and I was always conscious of it, though it did not constitute even 0.5% of my body, whereas within the country as a whole the archipelago constituted 8%. But the horrifying thing was not that this tumor pressed upon and displaced adjacent organs. What was most terrifying about it was that it exuded poisons and infected the whole body. And in this same way our whole country was infected by the poisons of the archipelago, and whether it will be able to get rid of them someday, only God knows. Can we, dare we, describe the full loathsomeness of the state in which we lived, not so remote from that of today? And if we do not show that loathsomeness in its entirety, then we at once have a lie. For this reason, I consider that literature did not exist in our country in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because without the full truth, it is not literature. And today they show this loathsomeness according to the fashion of the moment, by inference, an inserted phrase, an afterthought, or hint, and the result is again a lie. This is not the task of our book, but let us try to enumerate briefly those traits of free life which were determined by the closeness of the archipelago or which were in the same style. 1. Constant fear. As the reader has already seen, the roster of the waves of recruitment into the archipelago is not exhausted with 1935 or 1937 or 1949. The recruitment went on all the time. Just as there is no minute when people are not dying or being born, so there was no minute when people were not being arrested. Sometimes this came close to a person, sometimes it was further off. Sometimes a person deceived himself into thinking that nothing threatened him, and sometimes he himself became an executioner, and thus the threat to him diminished. But any adult inhabitant of this country, from a collective farmer up to a member of the Politburo, always knew that it would only take one careless word or gesture and he would fly off irrevocably into the abyss. Just as the archipelago beneath every trustee lay the chasm, and death, of general work, so beneath every inhabitant lay the chasm, and death, of the archipelago. In appearance, the country was much bigger than its archipelago, but all of it and its inhabitants hung phantom-like above the latter's gaping maw. Fear was not always the fear of arrest. There were intermediate threats, purges, inspections, the completion of security questionnaires, routine or extraordinary ones, dismissal from work, deprivation of residence permit, expulsion or exile. The security questionnaires were so detailed and so inquisitive that more than half the inhabitants of the country had a bad conscience and were constantly and permanently tormented by the approach of the period when they had to be filled out. Once people had invented a false life story for these questionnaires, they had to try to not get tangled up in it. The aggregate fear led to a correct consciousness of one's own insignificance and of the lack of any kind of rights. Nadezhda Mandelstam speaks truly when she remarks that our life is so permeated with prison that simple meaningful words like "they took," or "they put inside," or "he is inside," or "they let out," are understood by everyone in our country in only one sense, even without a context. Peace of mind is something our citizens have never known. 2. Servitude. If it had been easy to change your place of residence, to leave a place that had become dangerous for you and thus shake off fear and refresh yourself, people would have behaved more boldly and they might have taken some risks. But for long decades we were shackled by that same system under which no worker could quit of his own accord, and the passport regulations also fastened everyone to particular places, and the housing, which could not be sold, nor exchanged, nor rented. And because of this, it was an insane piece of daring to protest in the place where you lived or worked. 3. Secrecy and mistrust. These feelings replaced our former open-hearted cordiality and hospitality, which had still not been destroyed in the 20s. These feelings were the natural defense of any family and every person, particularly because no one could ever quit work or leave, and every little detail was kept in sight and within earshot for years. The secretiveness of the Soviet person is by no means superfluous, but it is absolutely necessary, even though to a foreigner it may at times seem superhuman. The former Tsarist officer K.U. survived and was never arrested only because when he got married, he did not tell his wife about his past. His brother, N.U., was arrested, and the wife of the arrested man, taking advantage of the fact that they lived in different cities at the time of his arrest, hid his arrest from her own father and mother, so they would not blurt it out. She preferred telling them and everyone else that her husband had abandoned her, and then playing that role a long time. Now these were the secrets of one family which I was told 30 years later, and what urban family did not have such secrets? 4. Universal ignorance. Hiding things from each other and not trusting each other, we ourselves helped implement that absolute secrecy, absolute misinformation, among us which was the cause of causes of everything that took place, including both millions of arrests and the mass approval of them also. Informing one another of nothing, neither shouting nor groaning, and learning nothing from one another, we were completely in the hands of the newspapers and the official orators. 5. Squealing was developed to a mind-boggling extent. Hundreds of thousands of security officers in their official offices, in the innocent rooms of official buildings, and in pre-arranged apartments, sparing neither paper nor their unoccupied time, tirelessly recruited and summoned stool pigeons to give reports, and this in such enormous numbers as they could never have found necessary for collecting information. One of the purposes of such extensive recruitment was, evidently, to make each subject feel the breath of the stool pigeons on his own skin, so that in every group of people, in every office, in every apartment, either there would be an informer, or else the people would be afraid there was. I will give my own superficial speculative estimate. Out of every 4 to 5 city dwellers, there would most certainly be one who at least once in his life had received a proposal to become an informer, and it might even have been more widespread than that. Quite recently I carried out my own spot check, both among groups of ex-prisoners and among groups of those who have always been free. I asked which out of the group they had tried to recruit, and when and how, and it turned out that out of the several people at a table, all had received such proposals at one time or another. Nadezhda Mandelstam correctly concludes, beyond the purpose of weakening ties between people, there was another purpose as well. Any person who had let himself be recruited would, out of fear of public exposure, be very much interested in the continuing stability of the regime. 6. Betrayal as a form of existence. Given this constant fear over a period of many years, for one's self and one's family, a human being became a vassal of fear, subjected to it, and it turned out that the least dangerous form of existence was constant betrayal. The mildest and at the same time most widespread form of betrayal was to not do anything bad directly, but just to not notice the doomed person next to one, not to help him, to turn away one's face, to shrink back. They had arrested a neighbor, your comrade at work, or even your close friend. You kept silence. You acted as if you had not noticed, for you could not afford to lose your current job. And then it was announced at work, at the general meeting, that the person who had disappeared the day before was an inveterate enemy of the people. And you, who had bent your back beside him for 20 years at the same desk, now by your noble silence, or even by your condemning speech, had to show how hostile you were to his crimes. You had to make this sacrifice for the sake of your own dear family, for your own dear ones. What right had you not to think about them? A mother, children, and perhaps they at least ought to be helped? No, that would be dangerous. After all, these people were the wife of an enemy, and the mother of an enemy, and they were the children of an enemy, and your own children had a long education ahead of them. And one who concealed an enemy was also an enemy, and one who abetted an enemy was also an enemy, and one who continued his friendship with an enemy was also an enemy. And the telephone of the accursed family fell silent. And in the hustle of a big city, people felt as if they were in a desert. And that was precisely what Stalin needed. And he laughed in his mustaches, the shoeshine boy. In evaluating 1937 for the archipelago, we refused it the title of the crowning glory. But here, in talking about freedom, we have to grant it this corroded crown of betrayal. One has to admit that this was the particular year that broke the soul of our freedom and opened it up to wide corruption on a mass scale. Yet even this was not yet the end of our society. As we see today, the end never did come. The living thread of Russia survived, hung on until the better times came in 1956, and it is now less than ever likely to die. The resistance was not overt. It did not beautify the epoch of the universal fall, but with its invisible warm veins its heart kept on beating. Every act of resistance to the government required heroism quite out of proportion to the magnitude of the act. It was safer to keep dynamite during the rule of Alexander II than it was to shelter the orphan of an enemy of the people under Stalin. Nonetheless, how many such children were taken in and saved? Let the children themselves tell their stories. And secret assistance to families did occur. And there was someone who took the place of an arrested person's wife who had been in a hopeless line for 3 days, so that she could go in and get warm and get some sleep. And there was also someone who went off with a pounding heart to warn someone else that an ambush was waiting for him at his apartment, and that he must not return there. And there was someone who gave a fugitive shelter, even though he himself did not sleep that night. Nowadays, it is quite convenient to declare that arrest was a lottery. Ehrenberg. Yes, it was a lottery, all right, but some of the numbers were fixed. They threw out a general dragnet and arrested in accordance with assigned quota figures, yes, but every person who objected publicly, they grabbed that very minute. And it was turned into a selection on the basis of soul, not a lottery. Those who were bold fell beneath the axe, were sent off to the archipelago, and the picture of the monotonously obedient freedom remained unruffled. All those who were purer and better could not stay in that society, and without them it kept getting more and more trashy. You would not notice these quiet departures at all, but they were, in fact, the dying soul of the people. 7. Corruption. In a situation of fear and betrayal over many years, people survive unharmed only in a superficial bodily sense, and inside, they become corrupt. So many millions of people agreed to become stool pigeons, and after all, if some 40 to 50 million people served long sentences in the archipelago during the course of the 35 years up to 1953, including those who died, and this is a modest estimate, being only 3 or 4 times the population of Gulag at any one time, and after all, during the war the death rate there was running 1% per day, then we can assume that at least every third or at least every 5th case was the consequence of somebody's denunciation and that somebody was willing to provide evidence as a witness. All of them, all those murderers with ink, are still among us today, and most often they are prospering, and we still rejoice that they are our ordinary Soviet people. 8. The lie as a form of existence. Whether giving into fear or influenced by material self-interest or envy, people can't nonetheless become stupid so swiftly. Their souls may be thoroughly muddied, but they still have a sufficiently clear mind. They cannot believe that all the genius of the world has suddenly concentrated itself in on one head with a flattened, low-hanging forehead. They simply cannot believe the stupid and silly images of themselves which they hear over the radio, see in films, and read in the newspapers. Nothing forces them to speak the truth in reply, but no one allows them to keep silent. They have to talk. And what else but a lie? They have to applaud madly, and no one requires honesty of them. The permanent lie becomes the only safe form of existence, in the same way as betrayal. Every wag of the tongue can be overheard by someone, every facial expression observed by someone. Therefore, every word, if it does not have to be a direct lie, is nonetheless obliged not to contradict the general, common lie. There exists a collection of ready-made phrases, of labels, a selection of ready-made lies, and not one single speech, nor one single essay, or article, nor one single book, be it scientific, journalistic, critical, or literary, so-called, can exist without the use of these primary clichés. In the most scientific of texts, it is required that someone's false authority or false priority be upheld somewhere, and that someone be cursed for telling the truth. Without this lie, even an academic work cannot see the light of day. And what can be said about those shrill meetings and trashy lunch break gatherings where you are compelled to vote against your own opinion, to pretend to be glad over what distresses you? In prison, Tenno recalled with shame how 2 weeks before his own arrest he had lectured the sailors on the Stalinist Constitution, the most democratic in the world. And of course, not one word of it was sincere. There is no man who has typed even 1 page without lying. There is no man who has spoken from a rostrum without lying. There is no man who has spoken into a microphone without lying. But only if it had all ended there. After all, it went further than that. Every conversation with the management, every conversation in the personnel section, every conversation of any kind with any other Soviet person called for lies. And if your idiot interlocutor said to you face to face that the Colorado beetles had been dropped on us by the Americans, it was necessary to agree, and a shake of the head instead of a nod might well cost you resettlement in the archipelago. Remember the arrest of Cholpanyov in Part 1, Chapter 7. But that was not all. Your children were growing up. And if the children were still little, then you had to decide what was the best way to bring them up, whether to start them off on lies instead of the truth, so that it would be easier for them to live, and then to lie forevermore in front of them too, or to tell them the truth, with the risk that they might make a slip, that they might let it out, which meant that you had to instill into them from the start that the truth was murderous, that beyond the threshold of the house you had to lie, only lie, just like Papa and Mama. The choice was really such that you would rather not have any children. 9. Cruelty. And where among all the preceding qualities was there any place left for kind-heartedness? How could one possibly preserve one's kindness while pushing away the hands of those who were drowning? Once you have become steeped in blood, you can only become more cruel. And, anyway, cruelty, class cruelty, was praised and instilled, and you would soon lose track, probably, of just where between bad and good that trait lay. And when you add that kindness was ridiculed, that pity was ridiculed, that mercy was ridiculed, you'd never be able to chain all those who were drunk on blood. 10. slave psychology. In various parts of our country, we find a certain piece of sculpture, a plaster guard with a police dog which is straining forward in order to sink its teeth into someone. In Tashkent, there is one right in front of the NKVD school, and in Ryazan it is like a symbol of the city, the one and only monument to be seen if you approach from the direction of Mikhailikov, and we do not even shudder in revulsion. We have become accustomed to these figures setting dogs onto people as if they were the most natural things in the world. Setting the dogs onto us. End of part 4.